Please welcome to the stage, Charles Blow.
Hello, and welcome to Ideas at Forward with Charles Blow, where we bring together some of the world's best activists and thinkers to try to solve some of the world's biggest problems. And tonight we are discussing mental health disabilities that we cannot see. And we are being joined by Kevin Love, NBA champion and founder of the Kevin Love Fund, which aims to help people to prioritize their mental health and well-being, and Yolo Akili Robinson, founder and executive director of BEAM, a nonprofit mental health collective. So I want to start with a big question. I want both of you to weigh in on this. Why is it that we still do not treat mental health with the same urgency and care with which we treat physical health?
We live in a deeply what I call ableist culture.
Okay.
Right? A culture in which performance, productivity is highlighted above all things. I often call it like we have it's profit over care, right? And so I think that is the context in which we exist in, which fuels this inability to really kind of hold and recognize when things we associate with vulnerability, things we associate with softness, things we associate that are making you not productive, right? Because when we talk about the history of mental health in this country, it's really about the pathology of you're not a productive person, right? So now you are ill, right? You can't produce, your body doesn't do this, your mind doesn't do this, so now you are pathology as opposed to you are different. You need different support, you need different resources, you need different kinds of care, right? And so I think we always have to start with that backdrop of ableism and how it influences this rugged American individualism we have, right? You just gotta keep on going, push through, make through. That is one of the many reasons that I think in this moment we have not, this moment in our culture, we haven't taken mental health seriously with a significant investment outside of there's a lot of conversation. But when I think about public investment, philanthropic investment, that doesn't reflect a commitment to mental health, in my opinion.
Kevin, I want you to weigh on that as well, because if we saw a brown spot the size of a nickel on our face or on our shoulder, we're running to the doctor. But we don't engage with our mental health with the same sort of urgency. We can feel bad for long periods of time, not tell people, and be afraid to disclose that. Why is that?
Yeah, and it's a great point that Yolo mentioned. First of all, thank you for having me here at the Forward Foundation. This is truly an honor in speaking about something that we are very passionate about. But I think it's definitely institutional. It starts really at the top. It isn't taught to us in schools, and I know I have a unique perspective because I'm an athlete, and we so much of the time look after our physical health, and then we kind of are taught a playbook early on. I certainly was for my father, who was born in 1949, that just to compartmentalize it, put it over there, your feelings don't matter, your feelings aren't valid. And I think that made us and made me emotion phobic early on within my life, and certainly within my career as well. But within schools, within our education system, we aren't taught at an early age. We're taught sexual health, we're taught physical health, but it's often overlooked. Speaking about the feelings wheel and really being able to articulate and not tell a story, actually articulate what we're feeling in that moment and why, being able to name it, being able to have the language or express yourself through different mediums in order to then do the work early and get early intervention. So I think in having a father who struggled with mental health and somebody that was very depressed, our family has always been prone to melancholy, and it's generational. I don't think that we've had the proper teachers within our educational system, but we're not well equipped then as well to teach our kids or teach different members of our family within that space. And again, I think we all, men and women, suffer in silence. But for every 10,000 people that are struggling, there's only one therapist. There's only one licensed therapist in order to take care of that next person. So there quite literally isn't enough from an educational standpoint, but also from a medical standpoint in order to take care of people. So I don't think we're looking at physical health the same as mental health, because we also, across the board, quite literally don't have the resources.
Kevin talked about this idea that we teach physical health in schools, we teach sexual health in some schools, but we don't teach mental health, kind of healthy mental dispositions in relationship to your emotions. Is that changing? How do we get that to be better? How do we have more people with curriculum? How is it not just on teachers' shoulders to be undercover triage mental health experts?
Yeah. So the first piece, I think they're false dichotomies. I think that the West has this kind of belief that physical health is here, emotional health is here. These things are not interconnected. And when I think about indigenous perspectives, when I think about other cultural perspectives, the idea that they're all interwoven, right? When we talk about young people particularly, there's a large body of research is showing that like when children are malnourished, they often embody symptomology that is akin to ADHD, right? And so now they're like wondering like, well, is it ADHD or is this child hungry? Right? Because there's a physiological correlation to how it might show up in my nervous system, right? And so I think that like one thing we have to really challenge at the core of what I call like colonial psychology is the idea that everything's separate, that like your physical isn't connected to your mental health, that like your emotional health. And how do we name that? Like, for example, in many of our communities, we talk about somaticization, right? The reality that I might not verbalize what I feel, but my body always remembers what I feel, right? I have folks in my community, my family, who always talk about shoulder pain or leg pain. Go to a physical doctor. Doctor says there's nothing wrong with that part of your body. But what happened is this shoulder is the same day maybe I lost a loved one. And so I'm holding that grief and that sadness here. I'm holding that pain in a different part of my body, right? Like there's all this, there's an interconnectedness to our bodies and our mental health that we have just begun to explore. I know Western psychology tries to present itself as if it has solved all the things, but that's not true. There's a lot of and wisdom in indigenous belief systems that show the interconnectedness of how our bodies and our emotions operate. So I want to say that piece. Okay. The second piece I want to say is, I know, Kevin, you said earlier about like, the one therapist per like 10,000 people, and we talked about this piece too. For me, one of the reasons I started Beam is because when I was looking at my community, I was recognizing that the mental health system was not designed to serve my community and was not serving my community. But the people I saw who were the first responders, who were holding the critical mental health crisis, they were teachers, they were faith leaders, they were community healers, they were activists. Those were the folks who formed what I call this underground wellness network.
And tell our audience what BEAM stands for.
Yes, Black Emotional Mental Health Collective, excuse me. And so I saw these people showing up as this underground wellness network, right? They were the folks who I saw teachers who were advocating for kids who they saw were not being monitored appropriately by their psychiatrists on the dosage of the drugs they were on. I saw pastors trying to keep kids out of psychiatric holes because in many states, when you are in a psychiatric hole, it's very difficult to get out of that, right? And it becomes very complicated and traumatizing for many youth, right? And so one of the reasons I started Beam, because I was like, who is investing in this underground wellness network that is holding what many therapists and social workers are not able to hold or can't hold or are just not in the community to hold, right? Because taking the approach with Western mental health, which is just like build up the professional class. Yes, we need more psychiatrists and therapists. I will never dispute that. We always need. But we also need to think about it from, once again, a collectivist standpoint, an indigenous standpoint. How do I make sure everybody in the village has more skills, more tools, and more resources? How do I make sure I create collective learning spaces? This is what we do at Beam. As opposed to I'm going to take you, one person, and take you into therapy, I'm bringing you, your mom, your dad, your cousins. We're all going to go into a group space, and we're going to learn about unlearning rigid masculinity. We're going to learn about PTSD. We're going to learn new coping skills and strategy skills on a collective level. And now what's happened is you're taking that back to your family and your community, and it's dispersed as opposed to being individualized. We need collective care. The future of mental health in this country is about healing and wellness circles. It's about collective care. We will always have one-on-one therapy, but we need to build up the capacity of everyone in our village to have more tools and skills to hold space and also normalize spaces where fathers are coming together who are new fathers to process with other fathers. right? Where we, for example, in our network, we have groups of women who are grieving come together as mothers who have lost children, right? That's a selective space, a really difficult space, but they need support from people who've been through that, right? We have spaces that are also for people who are formerly incarcerated who say, I want to heal or try to move through some of the experiences I've been through, right? Collectivism is important because, as Dr. Vivek Murthy from the former U.S. Surgeon General talks about, isolation is killing our communities, right? It's the idea that I think I'm alone, I'm the only person this is happening to. But when we put us in the space and we actually, with guided, trained facilitators, people holding that space to help us see each other, people feel more akin to learn, to listen, to be safe. Especially, we talked about the older generation, right? I have groups we do with older Black men. I haven't been able to get some of my colleagues who are older to go into a one-on-one therapy situation because it feels like you're judging me with that pen and paper across from me. But I can get you to sit in a circle in a barbershop and have a conversation. Because there's something leveling about that. We're seeing each other. And it's also sacred. It's also a part of the ring shout. It's a part of the church culture. It's a part of sports culture. The circle is sacred, right? Those are pieces I think we need to encourage.
Kevin, you made some waves when you published an op-ed about a mental health challenge you were having during a game. Tell us about that experience, writing the op-ed, and what responses you got from that.
Well, I had a very public panic attack in November of 2017, and it was within a safe space. You talked about having that community, having that space where I could run to, and it was free. It was a place that I always knew that I could be myself. I wouldn't be looked at as different, but in having that very public panic attack and mental health episode on the court, in the locker room, at our training facility, it took that away from me. And it compromised a lot of my identity. I mean, so much of my identity was wrapped up in being just a basketball player. And I couldn't separate not having the court and going about my everyday life and being Kevin Love, the individual being Kevin Love, that wasn't just a basketball player. So I had suffered from acute anxiety growing up in my life, a lot of bouts with severe depression, and not unlike my dad, found myself in bed. I would go to school, I'd go to basketball practice, and then the rest of the time I would just kind of be in a dark room and in my bed throughout. So I had that public panic attack, and a lot of that year was very complex and layered. There was the expectations, there was the problem being estranged from my family, there was, of course, the mental health problems that I had faced and dealt with throughout the course of my life. So a lot of these pillars were falling within my life that led to that point. And the team didn't know what was going on, so they were turning on me. And while I was having success on the court, that expectation was weighing on me very heavy. And it was 2018. I'd been named an All-Star that year, but I'd broken my hand. The team had turned on me, started talking about potentially what was going on with my mental health out in the open, and I started getting questions about it at All-Star of that year, which was in Los Angeles, from the global media. So I said, okay, I want to take this into my own hands and take control, for lack of a better term, of my story. I didn't want anybody else to share my story. So in March of that year, I decided to pen a first-person article that everybody's going through something, and the response to that was incredible. It was unlike anything I could have ever expected, and it was overwhelmingly a positive response. So we took that, and in September of 2018, I started the Kevin Love Fund, and fast forward to now, we started a social emotional learning curriculum where we model vulnerability within the classroom. So we're not going down the hall to a counselor or even a therapist. It's community driven. The teachers are modeling it, and it's been amazing to see the students and student athletes open up and share their stories within the classroom. And it just creates so much dialogue. It allows the kids through 15 different lesson plans and different mediums to be able to express themselves. If they can't do it through the spoken word, they can do it through music, they can do it through, they can share it through photography. So they have a way of expressing themselves that they wouldn't otherwise have had. So we're setting up the next generation for a lot of success and, allowing them to be empowered within a space that they wouldn't otherwise maybe have tried or accepted.
Why do you think that professional athletes across sports, both men and women, have emerged as the leaders on this conversation about mental health in recent years?
A large part of it is the same reason I hung on, Shaquille O'Neal and Charles Barkley's every word, because I quite literally looked at them as superheroes. They were my heroes growing up, and I think that we're so much of the time looked at as indestructible and made of Teflon and bulletproof, and people that quite literally can't be hurt. Success is not immune to depression. This is something that doesn't discriminate, and we are certainly have our share of struggles as well. But I also believe that the fact that the game has become so global. You just saw this year Steph Curry speak about him having performance anxiety, and LeBron James talking about going and seeing a therapist. So these conversations matter because of so many eyes are on them, and so many kids look to them as heroes, hang on their every word, just like I did. The same thing could be said for Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka. So it's all sports, it all intersects. And again, it's that idea of taking care of your body and mind, and who better to show that and outwardly express that than athletes. So I do think that reach matters, as well as we look at it like we have a responsibility to share that at the highest level.
Globally, depression is one of the leading causes of illness and disability among adolescents. Our children are experiencing a crisis. What is fueling that crisis, and how can we best help and support these children?
Well, I live in Los Angeles, and I can tell you some of the things that are fueling the mental health crisis for the youth that I am in community with are the divestment of public funding, the fact that their schools are no longer safe spaces, or that children are worried about their parents, their families, their loved ones being snatched away. Mm-hmm. Where education systems and schools feel like prisons. I go to some of the school systems and I'm like, wow, I feel like I'm incarcerated coming in here. What does it feel like for the students coming here every single day, right? And so when we talk about the rising rates of adolescent mental health, we have to name those things, name about the systemic and structural realities. Because the reality is, in my opinion, we're just now getting this data. But when I talk to my great-grandparents, when I talk to my parents about their experience, they were suffering from similar things too. It just wasn't being captured. It wasn't being documented. It was being silenced and suppressed down, right? So I'm even curious about, is it new or is it just now being named? Right, is my question about it, right? But I think we have to look at all those structures and what's happening in our culture, in our world, and also how, younger people are coming to a world, they have access to all this information, they see this. They see what's happening in the world while things are becoming more increasingly unaffordable. They're also having experienced, a lot of kids that I talk to who are very smart, because I always say this piece too. We like to think of mental health as like, mental health therapy as being this really glorious thing. You get a nice therapist with a big light, well-lit room, and she has a great big bookcase, and that's not the reality for most folks, right? I know most of the kids I talk to, they say they don't see a difference between the prison industrial complex and the mental health industrial complex, right? They're the same people who talk about saying, guess what, when somebody says mental health, I think about the social worker who took my cousin away, right? So we have to get real honest about what's happening in therapy and what's happening in the mental health system for poor and disadvantaged and underserved communities, because it's not glorious and safe. Even working with kids who told me, like, hey, actually for years I've been having ideations and thoughts about hurting myself. Mm-hmm. But guess what? I know that school counselor is a mandated reporter. I'm not going to tell her, because you know what happens? I saw what happened to Ricky. And he was taken to put on a hold, and he came out, he ain't been the same since. We have a mental health system that literally puts people through a psychiatric process that we have large bodies of data that shows further traumatizes people, right? And so they were wondering, why aren't the kids telling us when they're having those experiences about hurting themselves? Because they're scared of what will happen. to them. So how do we make safety? How are we in a world where we know it's increasingly difficult to be here, and then we're literally incarcerating our heart, it feels like incarceration for young people, being pathologized for having a hard time being here. You know, these are the things that we have to address at the core of the system, right? I'm always fascinated with Western mental health. Like, you know, as somebody who really is deeply committed to African indigenous ways of being, you know, in Western mental health, when someone's having a psychiatric emergency or a psychiatric problem, the idea is I need to take you somewhere and isolate you, right? I'm going to put you on a hold in a cold padded room. You can't touch anybody. All that's I'm going to potentially give you drugs. That's a really curious perspective. When I think about indigenous perspective, they're like, you're in distress. You don't need isolation, you need connection. You need connection to your people. You need connection to yourself. You need connection to your land. You need connection to your spirit. We have got it completely mixed up. And the kids and the youth, and we all know that, and we're scared and are scared to engage the system because they're like, the system isn't going to protect me. The system isn't about going to save my mental health. And unfortunately, for a lot of our kids, that's the case. What kind of system have we created? Is this a wellness system? Or is this actually just a pathology system? A system that's really dedicated towards, are you productive or are you not productive? And if you are not productive, let's get you medication, force you into productivity, but let's not change the fundamental nature of the system which creates the unwellness.
Let me just follow one thing you said in there. I wanted to just be clear about this. Do we need to stop romanticizing the stoicism of our elders? Because maybe what we consider to be the stoicism was trauma.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, and many of us, you know, if we're doing our healing work and we've talked to our family members, we're like, yes, we do need to stop doing that, right? Because, you know, I think about my father and uncles and the men in my life, and, you know, we do a lot of work around masculinity and mental health. And, you know, sometimes you hear elders say, they're like, well, we didn't have mental health back in my day. Mm-hmm. I'm like, well, I'm not sure if that's the case, Dad. You know what I mean? Like, you had different strategies to navigate that, right? Because one of the crises that we're having in this country around masculinity is that we have a dominant concept of masculinity that has stripped the full humanity away from men. And me and Kevin were talking about this, right? We have people who are masculine and men folk who are literally believe that they don't have emotions. You know how many times I hear that? Like, I'm not really a feeling person. I'm like, you're a human being and you don't have any feelings? That's a belief that men have, right? And when you believe that you don't have emotions, those emotions are going somewhere.
Now, I'll let you finish, but like you feel like a failure that you even had those emotions.
That it's a failure. If you have those emotions, you've done something wrong, yes. Right? And you know, I tell this story all the time about, like, you know, my godson who was learning how to walk, and when he fell, I went to pick him up. And all the men, this is at a barbecue in my family, all the men are like, put him down, you gotta be a man. He's gonna be a punk. That's our playbook. Put him down, don't let him cry. And I'm like, he doesn't know how to walk yet. Right. And you all are obsessed with him becoming a man. What's going on? And for many of the men in the room, what's happening is that the coping strategy that many men in this country have learned to cope with patriarchy, for any black men to cope with racism, is cut off your emotions, suppress them, silence them, and then you'll be safe. Because if I show my vulnerability, they will exploit my vulnerability. They'll hurt my vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And what we're trying to now lean into and offer is that there is a time to be soft. There is a time to be strong. You have a right to the full range of your expression. It is not the responsibility of women to do the emotional labor for you. You need to get in there with your brothers and other men and do that work, right? This is the work that we're trying to shift us away from, but it is trauma, right? It's literally general patriarchy is trauma on not just men and women, but all people of all genders. And so how do we begin shifting that pattern to let men lean into the fullness of their humanity? Mm-hmm. What does that look like, you know?
Kevin, Yola was talking about young people fearing talking to some people because they're mandatory reporters. They feel like they will be punished in some way for doing that. How does that show up in the league, in sports, where there may be someone on staff by the team that you could talk to, in theory, but how does that play out? Because they are responsible to the team, not to you.
I mean, that's a great question. So, you know, when a player gets hurt or they have, you know, a mental health episode, they're thinking the same things. They're thinking, you know, how is this going to, you know, impact my mental health, or excuse me, my livelihood. And if I am going to expose this, what is my life going to look like moving forward? But you see it again all the time. It's you feel like it's going to be used against you. But the doctors who are looking out for their own best interests and the team's best interests and not looking out for mine, the individual, they had told me that I could play, and they had not given me all the information and all the facts that was going on, with my body. So, and you see it all the time. I don't want to come to somebody within the organization because there isn't that trust there. There isn't that feeling of community. And that's not a knock on the NBA. I think it's just an overall distrust, and we've been misled for so many years. But I think the beauty of it is there is a shift happening. But I still think that it's a tough space to navigate. It's a tough one to answer because there is so much ground to be made up.
How do you think the league or individual teams can address that? How do we make this better so people feel safe enough to say, I can still perform, but like anyone else with any other sort of injury, I am dealing with this issue, and I am still available to be part of this team? Yeah,
I think the simple answer is just to continue to have these conversations and eliminate the stigma. I mean, I think there is such a stigma still around, high performance and, having serious, mental health issues or dealing with grief or distrust among, teammates and the coaching staff. So it is very complex. And this, again, I'm not knocking the NBA by any means because this is uncharted, different territory for them. But I think that there's much to be done, even integrating that into high school and college basketball. And I couldn't even imagine what it would have been like, the social pressures, the social media, the outside influence that there's so much money within our sport now that is driving so many people to do things that are not pretty. And I think that children's and kids' mental health is kind of getting pushed to the side. And if you're a coach or you're somebody who's recruiting a kid out of high school, or you're doing it's happening now with pre-draft workouts within the NBA, and you're these kids have a serious problem with their mental health, or it's something that they're going to expose. It's ultimately it's something that they're going to turn inward on and not want to expose it. So I think the culture needs to shift, the dynamic needs to shift, and it's going to take the entire league looking at it and approaching it in a completely different way.
We need to protect disabled people, right? We have to really grapple with the fact that we live in a country that is not protecting disabled people, visible quote unquote disabilities and disabilities that are not visible, right? And we have to have structural and policy support and protections, right? And I think that's the piece that has to always be held in this conversation to make it safe enough for players to say, I need this. I am navigating this. For any human being to say, like, I need this, whether it's care or whatever that is, we have to really start to interrogate this, because all of us, as we age, we become increasingly more disabled, right? That's a part of the human journey and experience. But we live in a culture that still privileges this idea of high performance, hyper productivity that is not sustainable, like many things in our culture, right? And is not realistic and not healthy.
Kevin, you've done a lot of work with the NBA Players Association, taking players into school settings. What has been some of the most moving, remarkable, memorable experiences you've had having professional players talk to high school athletes?
I would say for me, it was seeing the power again of that community feel. And I've seen what LeBron has done with the I Promise School. I've seen what Chris Paul has done with providing resources within schools as well. DeMar, again, with his, mental health foundation. So we're in so many spaces where we're able to have a lot of influence. And, I'm very proud to be a part of the NBA where they're not just having our backs within the space and the things that we want to get done in the community. They're actually a driving force. They press go or they press send on a PSA, and it gets to hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, because it is such a growing sport. And again, that community instills major hope, and I believe that it should be a driving force within sports as well. Again, it's something that I've seen early on in my career.
I'm glad you invoked the idea of hope, because I'm going to ask both of you the question I ask all of our guests at the end of our sessions. What is it in this space that gives you hope for change? Start with you, though.
There are about 62 partner organizations we collaborate with across the world, United States, Haiti, and South Africa. And every single day I get an opportunity, I get the privilege to witness these folks, some of them who are therapists, some of them who are just everyday folks, who are coaches, who are teachers, who are indigenous healers, who are practitioners. I see them show up for our folks, and with so much care and so much thoughtfulness, with so little resources, with so little backing. I see them transform hearts. I see them save lives. And every day I realize that Underground Wellness Network, those folks are the people who are often forgotten. The Black, queer folks, the immigrant folks, the trans folks, the disabled. Seeing that collaboration, that connection, that Underground Network gives me hope, and it lets me know our communities have the power to heal, and that we will always have that network, right? Even as we see the continued divestment from public health infrastructure, I know that in our community, our folks are still gonna be on the ground. Our folks are still gonna be pulling up in the barbershops with the different events, and the stylists are gonna be doing whatever they can. And that gives me hope, because it lets me know that the movement for healing, the movement for healing justice, it's not going anywhere.
Okay. Kevin?
It's definitely tough to follow, but I would say, I see it within my fund as well. It's the teachers quite literally changing the course of a kid's life, and understanding that you change one kid's life, you might change their siblings or their peer group and their friends. It could be their family, and that just has a ripple effect. It really does snowball into potentially impacting the entire community. And I think, it's amazing to see that within the classroom, because that's a space where, you're supposed to go and be safe and being empowered to be yourself. But it's also having these type of conversations. What gives me hope is that we're on the same team.
Let's give them both a round of applause. Thank you, everybody.